Now, let me ask you, Jesus was born of what nation? He was born of a Jewish mom in a Jewish nation. He's a Jewish person. His chosen people, God's chosen people, are the Jewish people. And it was always them that God would bless, and through them bless the rest of the world. And so Jesus says, and this is hard to understand, so bear with me for a minute. He says, it isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs. Okay, you read that and you're like, no, wait a minute. Here's this poor woman in distress with a daughter who's possessed, and Jesus calls her a dog. Now, Jesus is actually not being harsh here at all. He's being brutally honest with her, and he's testing her. He's saying, shouldn't I focus on my kids first, the Jews? I'm a Jew. God's plan was to go to the Jews. I'm here to serve the Jews, and through the Jews, the world will be blessed. But when he mentioned here throwing it to the dogs, the word he used for dog. So in his day, the Jews would call all non-Jews dogs. It was not a compliment. It was it was filthy. It was a term of derision. But the word that they used in their language was the word for mongrel, like a filthy, wild, mangy mongrel. Okay? So that's the word that she would have been used to being called by the Jews. You mongrel. Jesus looks at her, and when he uses the word dog, it's the word for household dog. It's the dog that was the family member that was in the house. And so Jesus, just in the way that he words it here, says something that would have been extreme. He takes this woman who's an enemy, hated and despised by the Jews, places her in the same house as a Jew. Now, she's still a pet, right? The household pet. But he's kind of testing her and saying, no, you're in the house, but you're a household pet. And this was a crazy concept. She picks up on this immediately. She knows this isn't offensive. Instead, it's the very opposite. And so she replies, that's true, Lord. But even the household dogs, even the family dogs, under the table are allowed to eat the scraps from the children's plate. She's like, I can accept that. I can accept that I'm in the household, but not at the same level as the Jews. But even the family dog gets to sit under the table and eat the scraps that the kids drop. And if you're a nice kid, you drop the good stuff, right? She said, shouldn't I be able to access just a little bit of your time and attention, just a little bit of the crumbs that fall off the table of the Jews? And Jesus hears this answer, and he says, verse 29, good answer. Good answer. Now go home, for the demon has left your daughter. Now, in Matthew's account, he gives us word for word what Jesus replied when she said that. He said, dear woman, your faith is great. Your request is granted. And then Matthew records, and her daughter was instantly healed. Now think of this for a moment. Here's Jesus talking to this woman who has his possessed daughter. She asks for help, and Jesus just says, I see your faith. I see your humility. Yeah, what you've wished for is just granted. And instantly, back home, that woman's daughter, she's healed. She's back to total normal. And you have to ask, what kind of power is this? Is this like spiritual telepathy? I mean, you think of this. Jesus is not in sight or hearing range of this demon. He thinks the thought to oust the demon, and somehow that demon in that little girl reads the mind of Jesus and has to flee that little girl. Would you call that a superpower? Oh my goodness, no one had ever seen anything like this. This was insane. And so if you follow exorcisms and all these different ways of methods of exorcising a demon from a person, all that, none of them are like this. Jesus has this power that exceeds what any human has ever had, and he could simply think something or say something, and it's done instantly. Wow, verse 30, it says, and when she arrived home, she found her little girl lying quietly in bed, and the demon was gone. Wow. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about demon possession, and I mentioned that today, what we're taught in Scripture is that a demon can't possess a child of God, right? Because that's God's property. Your heart is his home. And so the number one way to deal with something like this is faith, is salvation. So I don't want to get into the weeds of that. I just simply want to look here and show you what happened and how Jesus used his power in that moment, that it wasn't until she got home that she realized, oh, it was done. 100% her daughter is healed. John MacArthur, writing a commentary on this, says, the Lord never refused anyone, Jew or Gentile, who approached him in sincere faith. Never. How did Jesus use his power? When people came to him in faith, no matter their condition or issue, he responded with action. All right, verse 31. Jesus left Tyre. That didn't turn out to be a relaxing getaway. And he went up to Sidon before going back to the Sea of Galilee and the region of the 10 towns. A deaf man with a speech impediment was brought to him, and the people begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man to heal him. So again, you see what happens with Jesus. No matter where he goes, word gets out, and people want Jesus to help someone who's hurting, suffering, dealing with something tragic. So this guy who's deaf also has a speech impediment. We believe that he probably had the speech impediment because he had likely been deaf from birth. And when you're deaf from birth, you don't know how sounds are supposed to sound. And so it often creates the speech impediment as well. You don't know how to talk because you've never heard anyone else talk. And so he's a deaf man with this speech impediment, unable to hear and unable to talk. Likely he's been ostracized his entire life. There was no sign language back then. There was no Braille. These people were cast aside. And here, this guy who's his entire life likely ostracized is about to get personal, undivided, one-on-one attention from Jesus, the Son of God. Verse 33. Jesus does something remarkable here, unexpected. Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone. You imagine, right? This guy is in this mob of people. He sees Jesus. He doesn't really know, like he can't hear. He doesn't really know what's going on, but he just knows that that guy is different. And everyone's looking at that guy, and that guy's asked to help him. And Jesus simply goes, come here, takes this guy and goes away from the crowd. I can imagine the guy like, why is he spending time with me? And what's going to happen here, right? So verse 33, Jesus led him away from the crowd so they could be alone. He put his fingers into the man's ears. This is not a spiritual matter. This is a physical matter. Jesus knows right away what the issue is. He puts his fingers into the man's ears. His ears were unable to hear. And then spitting on his own fingers, he touched the man's tongue. So Jesus right away is going to the root of the problems. His ears and his tongue both have issues. And Jesus touches, spits and touches. And you're like, what is going on? Looking up to heaven, he sighed and says, Epaphatha, which means be open. Now, you've been deaf probably your entire life. Never heard birds, never heard people, never heard a dog bark, a cat meow, and suddenly one day you're with this guy, you're off alone, and suddenly you see his lips moving and you hear something coming out. And it's the words, be opened. Even deaf people can hear the voice of Jesus. That's a superpower. He couldn't hear anyone else. Not long after this, a dead guy would hear the voice of Jesus. And last I checked, they don't have very good hearing. It's been said when Jesus got to the graveyard where his friend Lazarus was buried, when he said to come out, he had to say, Lazarus, come out, because if he just went to the graveyard and said, come out, everyone would have come out. That is the power, and his guys in the crowds are like, what in the world. Be open. Instantly, the man could hear perfectly, and his tongue was freed so he could speak plainly. As I was reading this, I was actually thinking of you, Ann. You work in speech pathology and help people talk, right? He didn't even need Ann. Like, he just instantly had not been able to talk. He had this impediment due to his deafness, it appears, and suddenly he's able to talk, not haltingly or stutteringly, but in complete sentences. He's able to talk. Could you imagine being that guy? He can hear, he can talk. Unbelievable. So what you're seeing here is Jesus, the power that he has is just, no one's ever seen anything like it. And to this day, we haven't seen anyone with this kind of power. But what he says next is, again, the little head scratcher. Verse 36. Jesus told the crowd not to tell anyone. Okay. I know you guys have just seen this deaf guy hear and this mute guy with the speech impediment talk. But can you keep it under your hat? But the more he told them not to, the more they spread the news. They couldn't keep it to themselves. But what you're seeing is, okay, why would Jesus have even bothered to say that? For many people who have great gifts or great abilities, the way they often use those abilities is they use them to draw bigger crowds. Go bring your friends, go bring your family, like, come and let's do this bigger, let's do this bolder, let's get more from you. And Jesus just repeatedly, when he uses his powers, does almost always the opposite and says, can you keep this under your hat? Can you not talk about this? Can you not make a big deal about this? I'm not here for the crowds today. I'm here for this guy. I'm here for this guy. Verse 37, they were completely amazed and said again and again, everything he does is wonderful. I think this is the best summary in the Bible of Jesus. Everything he does is wonderful. Wouldn't it be nice if your spouse said this about you? Everything he does is what? Everything she does, right? Everything they saw and heard from Jesus. They're like, we don't have a category. We don't have a box. We don't have an understanding of what he's doing and how he's doing it and why he's telling us not to talk about it. But everything this guy does